Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're coming in from. We have another large audience today, so again, thank you very much for attending one of our webinar sessions. Basically, our core developers speaking to your development team about the latest technologies that are happening here at JBoss. And today is all about SEAM. SEAM, our framework that's specifically built on top of EE6, so we know you're going to enjoy your session today with Shane. And to put that in context, we do these webinars once or twice a month, depending on how often we can get them on. And it's our development team speaking to your development team. So one of the things I encourage you guys to do is follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/jbossdeveloper. And also note our website, which is jboss.org/webinars. As we get new content basically identified that we want to talk to you guys about, we'll put that information out there. You can see that we have something for June coming up. And also, sign up for our newsletter list. So if you receive an email from me, and many of you do on a regular basis, we have many thousands of people on our newsletter list, feel free to sign up. There's a link from that jboss.org/webinars page, and it's the JBoss Developer Newsletter. That's the specific one we email to let you know about the next session with one of our core team. So just be aware of that. And if you got the email forwarded to you, feel free to sign up. We don't spam you with crazy stuff. It's pretty much all good content for the developer community. So today is all about SEAM 3. And you can see today being May 18th, we have talked about Hibernate 4 in the past and complex event processing, and we've done Hibernate multi-tenancy, and we've done programming model for EE6, specifically with CDI and Pete Muir. And that's just this year. We've done a series of these events for the last year now. This is actually webinar number 19 for us over the last 12 months or so. I'd encourage you to go out to jboss.org/webinars, and there you'll find the archives of those previously recorded webinars, things like clustering, things like class loading, things like JBoss tools, rich faces. All of that content is recorded for you and out there, and I encourage you to watch it. And then, of course, we will continue to give you great content as things move forward. If you look right now, June 15th for Drools Planner. So our Drools team is specifically going to come up and talk about the Drools Planner project. Very neat project. If you're familiar with the Drools project, I think you'll be very interested in this technology. And going forward in late June and July, I'm planning on multiple sessions related to App Server 7 and some of the new stuff happening with EE6. You're going to hear more about that coming up in June and July, so keep your ears on and do subscribe to our list because there will be some very interesting content for you there. And one thing we always have to say, just to make sure people understand our model and our business model to some degree, is that we are very much focused in this webinar series on the community side of the equation. Here we're going to talk about our open source projects that live out there at jboss.org, or perhaps they're projects we contribute to, like out of the Eclipse Foundation, or maybe it's stuff we work with Google or Apache, like Tomcat, etc. It could be any of the open source projects that we work on and contribute to that we may talk about in this channel. But do know that we do aggregate and collect and bring together all of those different open source projects to create our enterprise-supported products. All right, and that's on the right-hand side of this screen. So just keep that in mind, that we're very much focused on the community side and all the project work that's happening out there, so you can see what's going on in real time in the community. But if you do want long-term stability, multi-year support, 24/7 access to our people to help you keep that system running in production, that's the enterprise side of the equation, and that is not necessarily our focus here in these sessions. So just bear that in mind, and I've always put that caveat in because a lot of people always ask about that. So now, we're ready to put on Shane. Shane, of course, is our project lead for the SEAM project. He is coming to us from Australia, so it's the middle of the night or morning for him. It's like 2 a.m., so I'm very thankful to him to actually come out in this incredibly late or early hour, depending how you think of it. But the good news is, for those of you guys in APAC, right, Asia Pacific and all those places, he's real time for you guys right now. And so, Shane, thank you very much for joining us today, and please take it away.
Thanks, Bear. So, yep, I'm all caffeined up, so I'll try and stay awake during the next hour and hopefully try and keep it interesting for everyone. So in this presentation, we've got quite a lot of content to get through. What we're going to do is try and cover the current status of SEAM. Then we'll do a quick overview of most of the SEAM modules, and then we'll take a brief look at some of the cooler features that I think SEAM offers. Unfortunately, since we have less than an hour, we won't have anywhere near enough time to take a look at all of the features in detail. However, we may hold some future webinars where we do a deep dive into some particular SEAM modules. So following that, we'll briefly review some of the modules that we have planned for the future, and we'll quickly look at tooling and also how you can get involved in contributing to SEAM yourself. And then, as our kind host has already stated, we'll have a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you just think of any during the presentation, please make a note of them so you don't forget. Okay, so let's start with the SEAM status update. A few people might be wondering where SEAM fits in now that CDI has become the standardized component model for Java EE6. So to really answer that question properly, we're going to take a quick look at the origins of SEAM and how its goals have changed over time. So when the first beta version of SEAM was released in September 2005, one of its main goals was to reduce the complexity in developing JSF-based web applications. It achieved this by eliminating the requirement for a backing bean layer, which meant that developers could concentrate more on writing the business logic for their application and less on writing boilerplate code. Of course, as time went on, SEAM gained a number of other features also. So eventually, by the time SEAM reached version 2, it had gained a whole bunch of features, all designed to make life easier for the enterprise developer. And some of these features, which have been there since the very beginning of SEAM, can be considered as fundamental core features. So these features are the ones that really define the component model for the framework. So what we can essentially do is split up all of the things that SEAM provides into two groups. The core group, which is the stuff that defines the fundamental building blocks that the rest of the framework is built on, and the features, which are value-added, time-saving units of functionality that either solve some of the typical problems faced by application developers today or provide some kind of integration with a third-party library to allow it to be more easily used within SEAM's component model. So to borrow a phrase from Gavin, you're only ever writing one kind of stuff. So these two groups are represented on the left side of this diagram inside the SEAM 2 box. This diagram is quite interesting because it shows us how SEAM has evolved between version 2 and version 3. So in version 2 of SEAM, we had this essentially a monolithic stack that provided all of the core and feature parts of the framework essentially in a single jar file. So now that we have Java EE6 and CDI, the core part of the framework is now standardized as part of the container. What that leaves us with in SEAM 3 is a number of modular features which a developer can simply drop into their application. So one of the most exciting parts of the CDI specification is the portable extensions SPI. So what this does is allow us to extend or modify the behavior of the container to provide additional features beyond those provided by the container by default. So it's this feature of CDI that SEAM 3 makes really heavy use of to provide the extended functionality to a Java EE6 based application. So before we go any further, I need to quickly talk about the current release status for SEAM 3. I'm very pleased to say that the final version of SEAM 3 was released at the end of March this year. So yes, we do have a production version available right now. We are planning on doing a bundled release every 6 months, which means that SEAM 3.1 should be roughly due for a release in September or October this year. And the bundled release contains the latest versions of all SEAM modules plus consolidated documentation, API docs, reference docs, etc. We also have individual module releases happening pretty often, and we may perform individual module releases in between the bundled releases to either introduce like a new feature or to get important bug fixes into the hands of our developers. So finally, it's time to talk about some of the actual modules in SEAM 3. As a quick summary, each module generally provides a set of features that solve a problem or a set of problems within a single area of concern. That's the best way I can describe it. The modules are also designed as much as possible to be self-sufficient and not require a great number of dependencies. However, this can't be avoided in some circumstances. Our intent is to allow a developer to drop in a single SIEM module into their Java EE6 application to provide a feature that they need without pulling in a whole bunch of other dependencies. Having said that, though, some of the modules do provide enhanced features when they're used in conjunction with other modules, and we'll take a look at some examples of that a little bit later on. So in SIEM 3, we currently have 12 modules that are released, and there's a whole bunch more on the way. Each module is treated as its own self-contained project and has its own distribution download, its own documentation, Jira project, their own subpage on siemframework.org. Also, each module has a different module lead, and that person is responsible for deciding which features go into a module and when the module is released. For many of our modules, the lead is a member of the SIEM community and not actually a Red Hat employee. So SIEM really is an open source project in the truest sense. Okay, so let's take a look at each of the modules in a little bit more detail. First up, we have SIEM Catch. So one of the issues that many developers have when working on web applications is working out how to deal with various types of exceptions. So what SIEM Catch does is provide a unified exception handling framework so that all exceptions can be handled in a uniform manner in a single location. An exception handling class is annotated with the handles exceptions annotation to let SIEM Catch know that the class is used to perform a special exception handling routine for certain exception types. And each method in the class has an event parameter which can be annotated to control which exception types are handled by that method. So as for the exception handling logic, there's basically no restriction on what you can do. So you might want to redirect the user to an error page or display an error message in the UI, or you might want to roll back a database transaction, or perhaps you might want to do something like send a tweet or SMS message to notify some admin users that an error has occurred. Next module is SIEM Config. This module is designed to let you configure your beans. So currently we have one sub-module within this project that allows you to configure using XML. However, we do have plans to eventually support additional configuration formats such as DSLs, for example. So with SIEM Config, we have quite a lot of control over our beans. For starters, we can use it to set property values. But beyond that, what I think is one of the coolest features is being able to actually mess around with the beans metadata. So what we can do is add or remove qualifiers, create new producer methods or fields, or even define a whole new set of beans, each with their own property values. We can also use it to wire beans together. So what we have here is a very simple example. Let's say we have an application scope bean called stock ticker, and this bean class has a property called symbols, which is declared as a string array. So let's say that we want to be able to configure this symbols property to be a list of known stock market symbols. So what we can do is write our configuration like this. What the sReplaces tag does is it prevents the default bean from being installed, so and instead installs one with the property values that we've specified in the app symbols tag. So if we didn't include the sReplaces tag, then we would actually end up with two beans installed, one with an empty symbols list and one with the symbols that we configure. The other option here is to use the modifiers tag, and what this does is merge any annotations that we configure with the annotations that already exist on the bean. This isn't really relevant for this simple example, however there's probably a whole bunch of situations where it might be useful. Moving on, next we have SIEM Faces. So what this module does is provide additional integration between JSF and CDI. And also what it does is introduce some other really cool features if you use JSF for your view layer. So the first thing we have is support for JSF scopes such as the flash scope, render scope and view scope. We also allow you to inject JSF artifacts such as the faces context directly into your beans. We also have an event bridge for the JSF phase events and JSF system events. So you can actually write event listeners that perform an action at certain points of the JSF lifecycle. We also have what I think is probably the coolest feature in this module, which is type-safe view configuration. That's something that Brian, our Seeing Faces module lead, has been working on the last month or so. So with this particular feature, what it does is allow us to create a static enum inside which we can annotate its values to configure the views for our application. So we start off by annotating the containing class or interface with the view config annotation. You can see at the top of the code listing there. And what this does is let Seeing Faces know that this class contains our view configuration. Then for each view that we wish to configure, we can add a value to the enum and annotate that value based on how we want to configure the view. So in this example, we have a view defined by admin.xhtml, which we want to restrict so that only users with the appropriate admin privileges can view it. So to do this, we can use a type-safe security binding. I'll talk about them a little bit later in the presentation. But for now, we just need to know that it's a special annotation, and in this example, it's the admin annotation. So by placing this admin annotation on our enum value, what we're doing is restricting access to the view and only allowing users who are admins to access it. So let's take a look at another example. In this one, we're using URL mapping, the URL mapping annotation to configure a URL rewrite rule for our view. So under the covers, Seeing Faces is actually using pretty faces to provide the URL rewriting functionality. However, the configuration is still done in the same unified format. We have one more example to look at. So in this one, we're defining a global rule, which is represented by the /* view pattern. And this configuration provides authentication control. So dependent on whether the current user is currently logged in or not, like if they're logged in and they try to access a page for which they don't have sufficient privileges, they'll get redirected to the access denied view, which in this example is auth_error.html. If they're not logged in, they'll be redirected to the login view, which will give them an opportunity to authenticate. It's also important to note that you can mix and match the configurations. So that means that it's possible to have a view that's, for example, configured with a security binding and a URL rewrite rule. So the next module we're going to take a look at is Seem International. This module is really useful if you want your application to properly support a global user base. So the main feature of this module is its support for locales and time zones. What the module allows you to do is define an application locale and application time zone, and then for each individual user, allow you to override those defaults so that dates and times can be shown in the user's local time zone. And also text resources within your application can be localized to their own language. Seem International also has producer methods that allow you to inject a list of locales and time zones into your own beans. And what I think is one of the nicest things that this module provides is the Messages API. So what this is an abstraction layer for creating messages that need to be displayed in your user interface. So instead of having to create messages for the particular view layer that you're using, you can just code to the Messages API and it will do the conversion automatically for you. So for example, if you generally use JSF for your views, what you would typically do is use the Faces Messages class to create your messages. However, by doing this, what you're actually doing is creating a tight coupling between your view layer and your business layer. So what the Messages API allows you to do is eliminate that tight coupling, which is a really good thing if the services that your beans provide can be consumed by multiple clients. So we're going to have a really quick look at an example here. This example is really simple. We can see that the Messages object is being injected into our class at the top. Then inside the save user method, we invoke the messages.info method to create a message. We also have the option of specifying a resource key or type safe message at this point if we want to. Behind the scenes, the message gets converted into whatever format is required by the view layer. So if you're using scene faces, it will get converted into a faces message, which is then rendered in the user interface. Moving on to the next module. Scene persistence. This is a module that is quite limited in scope. However, in my opinion, it's probably one of the most important modules that we have. I'd almost argue that if you're developing a Java EE6 application today, that you really need to have this module. So what it does is firstly allow you to define a scene managed persistence context, which you can then use within your application to scope the persistence context to the conversation scope. We'll take a closer look at this feature in a moment. And secondly, it provides transaction support for non-transactional beans. Excuse me. So these days there's a growing trend for developers to use POJOs instead of EJBs. However, when you decide to use a POJO and step outside of the EJB stack, you lose some of the built-in features such as transactions. So this is where scene persistence picks up the slack. It provides a transactional annotation which allows you to denote your POJO bean as requiring a transaction. So here's a quick example of how we would define a scene managed persistence context so that we can inject an entity manager into our beans. This is actually quite an easy thing to do. All you need to do is declare a producer field somewhere in your application that's annotated with these 4 annotations that you can see here. So once we do that, we can then inject our conversation scope persistence context directly into our beans directly, just by injecting the entity manager. Okay. Next module up, we have scene remoting. So what this module does is it provides a number of features for interacting with your server-side beans via AJAX directly from a web page. So the simplest way to do this is to invoke the methods of your beans directly, and in a moment we'll look at an example of how easy that is. We also have complete client-side support for bean validation, which means you don't even need to make a round trip to the server to validate your client-side objects. It's all done in the browser, which, among other advantages, makes it possible to perform real-time validation of user input. So that's a really cool feature. Another feature which I think is quite misunderstood at the moment is the model API. This feature allows you to initiate a conversation on the server, after which you can interact with the conversation scoped object model on the client side. So any changes you make to the client side object graph generates a delta object. So once you've finished making your changes, this delta then gets communicated to the server, which then applies the exact same changes to the object model on the server side. It's quite a powerful feature, and I'm hoping that we build some more code that goes hand in hand with it during the following months. So let's look at a small example of how we can use the web remote annotation to make our beans accessible via AJAX. So the first thing we need to do is decide which of our methods we want to make invocable from the client. So after we've decided this, it's a simple matter of annotating the method with the web remote annotation. And what this does is indicate to the remoting module that the client is allowed to invoke this method directly. So in this example, we're annotating a method called getNewMessages, which returns a list of message objects. So the next step after doing that is to write the client-side code. If you're adverse to writing JavaScript, then there's some good news here. You don't have to write too much. So in this example, we can see that the first thing we need to do is define a callback function called getMessagesCallback. So this function simply displays a message telling the user how many new messages have been received. The next thing we need to do is invoke seam.createBean, which creates a stub object. And once we have that stub object, we can use it to invoke any of the bean methods that have been annotated with web remote. So we can see in this example that we pass in the fully qualified name of the class that we wish to interact with. It's also possible to specify a list of qualifiers here. So in case there's multiple implementations of your bean class available. And finally, we invoke the getNewMessages method on our bean stub. So if this method defined any parameters, then we would pass them in here. However, in this example, we don't have any. What we do pass in, however, is a reference to the callback function. So since the request is asynchronous, the client-side remoting API has to know what to do once it receives a response from the server. So in this case, we tell it to invoke our callback function, which then goes ahead and displays an alert box telling us how many new messages there are. So pretty easy, not too much JavaScript, so it shouldn't be too scary for most people. Next module is SeamRest. What this module does is integrate with REST-Easy, the REST-Easy project from JBoss, to allow you to serve JAX REST web services from your application. So among its features, we have integration with SeamCatch. We have support for bean validation, and also some pretty nice templating support also. So with the templating, what that does is allow you to use a templating engine such as FreeMarker or Velocity to define the templates for your JAX REST responses. It also provides a simple SPI for creating your own templating solution if you don't like the built-in ones. And lastly, it allows you to inject client objects for accessing remote full RESTful web services directly from your application. Next up, we have Seam Security. So this is actually a module I could talk about for hours, but since we only have a few minutes, I'll try to summarize the main features. In a nutshell, what this module provides is a whole bunch of authentication and authorization-related services. So if you choose to manage users and roles within your application, then there's an identity management solution which is built on top of PicketLink IDM, and this feature is going to really save you a lot of time. Alternatively, if you wish to join the growing number of sites that allow you to use OpenID to authenticate, say with your Google account or Yahoo account or some other OpenID provider, then there's full support for OpenID also. On the authorization side of things, we also have rule-based permissions, which is based on rules. We have traditional user, role, and group-based authorization, and also ACL-style permissions. So one of the features that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Seam Faces was type-safe authorization. So what this feature allows you to do is create an annotation which can then be applied to either beans, the methods of a bean, or a view configuration to provide security restrictions for that method or view. So we're going to take a quick look at an example of how that's done, because I think it's quite a useful feature. So it's quite simple. There's 3 steps that we have to follow. The first step is to create a security binding type. So this security binding type is simply an annotation that is itself meta-annotated with the @security binding type annotation. So by adding this annotation, we're letting Seam Security know that any methods that have the admin annotation require a pre-invocation check to ensure that the current user has the necessary privileges to invoke that method. Okay, so once we've created our annotation, the next step is to create an authorizer method. So what this method must do is return a Boolean value, reflecting whether the authorization check was successful or not. And inside the method, it has to perform the business logic that's required to determine whether the current user has the right privileges for that security binding. So the authorizer method itself needs to be annotated with the security binding annotation, also the secures annotation. And it's the secures annotation that tells SIEM security that the method is an authorizer method. Any parameters that the method defines are treated as injection points, so their values are automatically provided by the container. So in this example, we're injecting the identity object because it's required to determine if the current user is a member of the admin role. So the final step here, which is the easiest step, is to actually apply the security binding to your method. So this is as simple as putting the security binding annotation on any methods that you wish to secure. So when the user goes to invoke that method, a security check will be performed, and if the user has the necessary privileges, then the method will be invoked. Otherwise, if they don't, then an authorization exception will be thrown. So pretty cool stuff. So moving on again, next module we have is SIEM Servlet. So this module is actually quite boring. However, it does provide quite a few important features. First of all, it propagates Servlet lifecycle events to the CDI event bus. This might be useful, for example, if you wish to perform some kind of initialization after your application has started up. Also allows you to inject Servlet objects like the Servlet request, Servlet response, etc. directly into your beans. So finally, if you're using the SIEM Servlet module in conjunction with SIEM Catch, it's also possible to define an exception handler for exceptions that are thrown during a web request. So that allows you, for example, to return a 500 error. Next module is SIEM validation. So what this module does is integrate the latest version of Hibernate Validator with CDI. And what this gives us is a number of enhanced validation features. And I think the coolest of these features is probably the method level validation. So what this allows you to do is apply your JSR 303 annotations to your method parameters. So this can be a real time saver because it eliminates the need to perform explicit parameter validation within the body of your method. So you can simply annotate the parameter as not null, for example, and a validation exception will get thrown if the method is invoked with a null value for that parameter. Besides that, it also allows you to inject a validator factory directly into your beans to give you low-level access to the validation API. So our second last module is SIEM Wicket. This module has a few handy features if you're using Wicket for your view layer for your CDI-based application. So first of all, it supports dependency injection directly into your Wicket components, such as your page definitions and other Wicket components. The other thing this module does is provide conversational support for your Wicket views. So you can inject the conversation object into your Wicket page definition and begin or end the conversation from there. So you've got full control over the conversation. And it also supports conversation propagation between requests. Finally, we have SIEM Solder. So this module contains a whole bunch of useful features that are used by most of the other SIEM modules. I think pretty much all of the other modules have this module as a dependency. Basically, if we think that a particular utility class might be useful for more than one module, then it usually ends up in here. So some of the more interesting features are the Vita annotation. What this does is causes the container to ignore the class, and the requires annotation, which allows you to specify a fully qualified class name that must be present on the class path if you want that bean to be installed. So the requires annotation is really useful if you want to build optional support for a third-party library that may or may not be present at runtime. The resource loading feature is really useful if you want to access a resource on the class path or in the servlet context. The type-safe logging is another really cool feature, and conceptually it's quite a new idea. So under the covers, the logging API is built on the JBoss logging library. However, what it does is essentially allow you to create a class that acts as a logger definition, meaning that you can inject the logger definition class into your beans and then invoke the methods of that logger to achieve type-safe logging. So it's got full support for internationalization and localization. It's really quite a cool feature, so I recommend that you check out the reference docs for that if you'd like to find out more about it. Very briefly, I'd like to mention some of the newer modules that we have currently under development. So first off, we have Seam Social. What this module does is allow your application to integrate with a number of online social networking services, such as Twitter and Facebook. Next one we have is Seam Cron. So this module you can use to schedule automated events. Seam Reports. This is a really new module, which was just started within the last week, and there's already been some good progress made on it so far. Pretty obvious what it does from the name. And lastly, we've got Seam Mail, which is a CDI-based implementation of the Seam Mail feature that we had in Seam 2, which didn't actually make it into the Seam 3.0 release in time, but it'll be available shortly. I'd also like to quickly mention tooling. So we have two offerings in this area. First of all is JBoss Tools. What this is a plugin for Eclipse. JBoss Tools has really awesome support for CDI. So in fact, I heard a story that it was a little bit too good because it found some errors that we didn't know about in the CDI TCK, so that was pretty funny. The second option for tooling is Seam Forge. Forge is a shell-based rapid application development tool for Java EE6 applications. I'd actually planned to do a little live demo of Forge. However, I had some problems getting the webinar software running on my work notebook computer, which is a Linux machine. So I've had to run this presentation from my one and only Windows machine, which is solely used for games. So I guess instead of showing you Forge, I could show you my Portals 2 skills or something. Maybe not. Okay, so we're on to contributing. So before we get into the questions, I'd like to say that we're always looking for new contributors to Seam. So if you have any ideas that you think might make a useful Seam module, or if you're interested in contributing to an open source project, then please let me know. Contact me via email. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thanks for listening, and we have some time for some...
We do. We have plenty of time for questions, and quite honestly, it'd be pretty entertaining, Shane, if you threw down on Portal 2 for us. We could check that out.
Okay.
That's a joke, of course. But so we repurposed your gaming computer to be a WebEx webinar computer. But there are some good questions, and I'll try to work through them quickly. And then you can, of course, respond to them. We'll try to get them all answered. And more people, feel free to ask questions as we go here. One point made by Mike, it seems that the public adoption of Seam is slow, and it's not even included in comparisons like Matt Rabel's JVM Web Framework Roundup, as an example. Can you talk more about Seam and its production usage out there that you're aware of?
Yeah, so our focus has really moved away from promoting Seam 3 as a framework, and now what our focus really is to push Java EE6, because that's really the framework that we think that everyone should be using. So what Seam is now is probably the premier set of portable extensions for Java EE6. So technically, I don't know if you could even call Seam 3 a framework anymore, because all the framework type stuff is actually built into the Java EE6 platform now. So I hope that.
And I think that's a very good point, Shane. Is that really our purpose for Seam was to basically enable an environment that allowed us to extend the EE5 environment to EE6. And of course, that has been done now with EE6, and Seam continues to be complementary to the EE6 underlying framework and technology. And of course, any innovations that we see out here in the Seam world can also be adopted back. In many cases, will be thought about brought back into the standards themselves.
Definitely, and Seam as a framework previously was only pushed by us, by JBoss. Now that Java EE6 is a standard, it has a lot of big players backing it. So we've got Oracle, IBM. It's no longer like a small-time operation. So.
And another great question that I see here is, what about Maven support with Seam or Seam 3? What's going on with Maven?
That's a very good question. Okay, so when we were developing Seam 2 back in the Seam 2 years, we had a lot of users ask us for Maven support. So we listened to that, and Seam 3 is totally based on Maven now. So if you use Maven for your projects, then all of our artifacts are available in the JBoss Maven repository. So yes, we do care about our Maven users.
And I believe all our examples now have Maven demonstrated in them.
Yep, that's true. Everything's Maven-based.
Yeah, that's excellent. So it's much easier to get started with Seam 3 and Maven than it ever was with Seam 2.
Yep, definitely.
Another great question I see here, and I was also very curious about this myself, and that's related to Seam remoting. And so we have a question from Lincoln specifically. Can you invoke a @WebRemoteBean by its @named attribute instead of its fully qualified class name?
Yes, you can. So you can you can invoke it using either the name of the bean, or you can use the fully qualified class name in combination with the qualifiers if you need to.
And from the user's perspective, is it looking for changes happening on the server side bean and pushing them out to the client? You know, from a user standpoint, does it look like push?
In Seam 2, we actually had an experimental feature for JMS support in the client. It was a little bit buggy, so I took it out in Seam 3. But I do have plans to reintroduce it again at some stage, and also support the CDI event bus as well. So you can fire an event off on the server, and you can actually have an event listener within the client that will respond to that event when it's fired. So that's
okay. Another question here from Mike was related to. Basically, he says we deployed a Seam 2.2 GA-based application last summer. How difficult will it be to upgrade and migrate to Seam 3?
Okay, that's another really good question. One of the modules that we actually planned on having within the Seam 3.0 release was the Seam compatibility module. So we didn't actually have enough time to get that done to any satisfactory standard. So we are planning on we are planning on getting something in place for the Seam 3.1 release. There's actually a bit of a discussion going around within the Seam developer group whether or not the Seam compatibility module is going to be like anywhere near 100% compatible, because we have actually identified a number of issues that might mean we only get, say, 80% compatibility. So what we need to do is weigh up whether it's worth spending all of the development effort on a module that's only going to give you 80% compatibility for your SIEM2 based app. So we still haven't decided which way to go, but we've got a couple of team members working on that right now. So we'll keep the SIEM community posted as to what we decide.
Yeah, this question actually came up at JBoss World just last week here in Boston. I'm actually or 2 weeks ago. I'm back in Boston right now for this webinar. But our response to at the developer BOF where we had that question was, we really do need some people to explore what it takes to migrate their current applications and provide us feedback from, what hurdles are they encountering, what issues are there out there, and we can learn from that experience, make sure we document those things, and then see if the compatibility module will help that. What we don't necessarily want are hybrid SIEM2 3 apps as a result. They kind of look like SIEM3, but they're kind of really still SIEM2, and they kind of use both APIs, so that would be an area of concern.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for that very reason, something like a well-written migration guide might be a better thing to have.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's certainly, in worst cases, the migration guide will tell us how we can automate it through tooling if necessary, if possible, too. So a lot of other great questions here, Shane. How about any plans to add Flex BlazeDS support to SIEM3?
Yeah, we've actually got a community member who's offered to do some Flex integration, and I think if we go to GitHub, so I'm just looking at our repository here. So I should mention all our code is on GitHub under the SIEM organization. Okay, so what we actually do have is a Flex module. So at the moment, it's just a skeleton. So it looks like no work has been done on it yet. It is planned, and someone volunteered to work on it. However, it looks like they haven't made much progress at this stage.
Okay, and related to that, are there two GWT or GWT questions? One is related to, is there modules that supported? What about CDI features and GWT? And the other one is, can I use SIEM remoting with GWT?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. I don't know if you can use SIEM remoting with GWT. It's something that's interesting to explore, I think. As for GWT and CDI integration, that's something that the Aero project has taken care of. So Aero's got this really cool CDI integration layer, and in fact, that's the strategy we're adopting for like a number of our integration projects. So, for example, CDI support for InfiniSpan will be handled by the InfiniSpan guys. CDI support for Drools and JBPM is going to be handled by the Drools team.
And that was actually the next set of questions was, what about JBPM5? What about Drools?
Yep. So that's been taken over for by the actual owning projects team.
Do you have any status updates on any of those three?
No. I could find out though. We actually intend to bundle them in the next SIEM bundle release as add-ons. So I do need to coordinate that with each of the project leads so that we can get their integration modules into the SIEM bundle release.
And we certainly would want to advertise that the progress that those guys are making on the SIEMframework.org pages.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Yeah, so those things happen so the SIEM community would be aware of their progress. All right, some other great questions here. What about SIEMforge? Is SIEMforge a good tool to get started with my Java EE6 projects? Kind of an initial application setup?
Definitely. Yep. for any new user, I'd recommend they use Forge. It's really easy to use. You can generate an entire project skeleton with just a few commands. You can generate your model objects. Lincoln, I know you're listening, so what else can I say about it?
He can chat with us. We have his microphone muted right now.
He's thinking.
Yeah, and realistically, we probably do want to do a Forge-related presentation for you guys in the future. We did several presentations at JUDCon and JBoss World. We should come back to that.
Forge is really cool. So Lincoln's saying it's technology agnostic, so you can use it on any existing project. I should also say that it's completely extendable. It has a plugin SPI, so you can write your own plugins for it. So that's something each of the module leads actually still need to do, is to develop plugins for their modules for Forge. So, for example, let's say you're writing an application and you want to add identity management for your application. A Forge plugin for SIEM security would potentially be able to generate all of the model objects that you need, create the action beans, and a bunch of views to manage your users and roles and groups and that kind of thing. So that's the way that Forge is extensible via plugins.
Okay. Another good question I see here is there any built-in unit testing or integration testing support? And what would be the recommended approach for a SIEM 3-based application for unit testing, integration testing?
Achillean, definitely. I don't know if we've had a webinar on that so far, but if
it was a year ago almost that we talked about Achillean.
I think we need another one then.
It has made great progress, that project, so it's probably time for an update on that one.
Yep, definitely.
Another interesting question here is for SIEM cron, is it capable of running in containers that require common J? I've never even heard of common J, maybe you have, to run asynchronous jobs.
I can't answer that question myself because I don't know enough about the module. And unfortunately, since it's 3 a.m. in the morning here, Pete, who's the module lead, is actually in the same city as me. He lives in Brisbane, in Australia. So he'll be in bed right now, so he's not on IRC. So I can't
let's wake him up and see if we can... I'm playing.
Let's get him in here.
But that'd be a great question for our forums. Common J kind of puts in quotes here, IBM WebSphere. I guess that's a IBM WebSphere specific API. That would be interesting. Who
asked that question?
I don't know how to pronounce the name. Sire he Dudson, but we can get you that. We can get you that name.
If you send me an email, then I'll follow that up with Peter.
Okay. Related topic. Well, somewhat related. This is related to our enterprise versus .org. What version of SIEM is supported in the latest version of EAP, and what version of EAP will SIEM 3 appear in?
Okay, so SIEM 3 is going to be in EAP6. The current version in EAP 5.1, from off the top of my head, I think it's version 2.2.1. I could be wrong about that, but that's what I think it is.
That's what I remember it being as well. And definitely for SIEM 3, we're targeting it for EAP6. So, just watch all the EAP6 news and announcements as they roll out over the next several weeks and months.
Definitely. EAP6 is going to be huge.
So in relation to our JBPM5 question, someone wants to know if there will be any plans to support activity.
We don't have any plans currently.
Perhaps this person would volunteer to be a module lead for us and can bring that to bear.
I was just about to suggest that. I can see Daniel has just said that Activity has its own CDI module. He wrote it. Well done. That's a perfect example of the CDI portable extension community expanding.
Well, that's right. So Daniel, where is that activity CDI module? Maybe it's out there just in the activity download. I guess that's where it is. So one other question I had, and Shane, this is just for me, let's say as a new SEAM person, I'm approaching SEAM 3 for the first time. I didn't do SEAM 2. I know it's EE6 based. I want to start with the EE6 foundation for my architecture. But what would you say are the key modules that I probably need right out of the gate to include in my application? You know, in other words, what dependencies would I put in my Maven POM file to immediately start using?
Okay, I'd definitely have the config module and the persistence module. After those two, it would probably depend on which view technology I'm using. So if I'm using JSF, then I definitely have SEAM Faces. Also, security is quite an important feature to have for your application, so probably that one next. And then it depends on what kind of functions that your application requires. So depending on that, you'd add some of the other modules.
Okay, and the reason I ask that question is often when I'm looking at that big long list of modules, I'm sitting there going, wow, where do I get started? And that'd be a good blog posting or something to put out there on the SEAMframework.org website to say, okay, you know, you started your E6 project, you're starting with Maven. Here's the additional things we recommend to get just going up and running quickly if you're using JSF, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's definitely a good idea, and that's one area that we're a little bit weak on at the moment is getting started guides. So I'm hoping that that's something we'll address over the next few months. So SEAM 3 has been out for less than 2 months now, so we're kind of still recovering from the huge release effort. We will get back to writing guides.
Well, and we're out of time, but you know, I want to thank all the attendees. We had a large group of you guys show up here today, and you guys asked a lot of fantastic questions. Thank you very much for that participation. We always like people to come and ask us what they're interested in. That helps us make a better technology and a better project for you guys out there in the world. And if you guys have additional questions and additional input you want to give, please do join us on the forums in IRC for SEAM. And we hope that several of you guys start downloading and putting these things into your next generation EE6 projects. And for those who want migration, you know, SEAM 2 to SEAM 3 areas of concern, please look through your code bases and start figuring out what it would take for you, and that can help us build out the migration guide and documentation. And we would love you if you can contribute some of that back. You know, I wrote this script, I had to write, or whatever notes you took as you made the migration. You know, these are things that were gotchas or things I had to worry about. We look forward to all that feedback, and we're certainly very open for it. And Shane, thank you very much for staying up in the middle of the night with lots of caffeine, and for giving us a great session, a great overview session. One question that did come up, or two questions that did come up. One is, hey, you know, can we get a follow? Will this webinar be recorded? The answer to that is yes. We always drop the recordings out at jboss.org/webinars. And another question was, can I get a deeper dive best practices webinar around SEAM 3 in the future? We will certainly consider that, along with webinars on Archillion again, and Forge and things like that. And do note we have AS7, EE6 stuff still yet to come through this mechanism, this webinar mechanism that we're using. So Shane, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And for all our attendees, thank you guys. Have a good day, good night, wherever you are.